Howdy again everyone, and today I'm taking a look at a brand new lens from Tamron, their new 17 to 35mm f2.8 to f4 DI OSD. It's for Canon EF and Nikon F mount, full frame or APS-C digital SLR cameras, or mirrorless cameras if you're willing to use an adapter. It costs about £600 here in the UK, or $600 US, so it's slightly better value for money in America, but far less expensive than Canon's 16 to 35mm f4 ISUSM lens wherever you live, which actually has a darker maximum aperture. But note that this Tamron lens does not have image stabilization. Its focal length of 17 to 35mm means that it's primarily intended as a smaller sized ultra-wide angle zoom lens for full frame cameras, something that most full frame photographers like to keep in their kits, especially for landscape photography. If you own an APS-C camera and you want a lens with this kind of zoom range, then right away I'd recommend the legendary Sigma 18 to 35mm f1.8 instead, which will be far more suitable for you. But full frame shooters on a bit of a budget might like to pay attention here. Back in the old film days, Tamron and Sigma's 17 to 35mm f2.8 to f4 lenses were really popular, low-cost options for SLR camera owners. I actually reviewed this Tamron lens's ancient ancestor a few years ago, and its performance was rather a mixed bag. They're certainly quite cheap over on eBay though. But these lenses' extra wide aperture of f2.8 at the widest angle is handy. They're meant to be simple, lower budget options, so let's see about the newest Tamron lens's quality. First thing you notice is that it's not very big or heavy, weighing about a pound or just under half a kilogram. It's made of plastic, but actually feels quite solidly made. As well as the weather sealing gasket you can see on the metal lens mount, Tamron boasts that the lens is quite well weather sealed in all its other crevices. Oddly enough, I feel unwilling to test how waterproof this thing is, but it should survive a bit of rain here and there. The lens's zoom ring turns really smoothly and evenly. The focus system is a bit old-fashioned. The focus ring turns a little loosely and about 50 degrees around, with hard stops at each end, and it doesn't have full-time manual focusing. You should only turn that focus ring with the lens set to manual, not autofocus. The autofocus motor runs at an average speed, making a small whirring noise after a small delay. It does work quite accurately though. It all comes with the usual lens caps and a plastic hood, and its filter size is 77mm. I'll mention again here that the lens does not have image stabilization, but that's not such a huge problem on an ultra-wide angle lens, and overall, despite its relative simplicity, its build quality is really quite nice. Let's see about image quality then. First, I'll test it on my older 20 megapixel full frame camera, a Canon 6D. Straight from f2.8, the lens is brilliantly sharp in the middle, with punchy contrast and neutral colours. The corners are also very sharp, with minimal chromatic aberration. They stay this sharp down to f4 and even down to f11. Stop down to f16 and a little softness begins to appear due to the effects of diffraction. Let's zoom in to 35mm then. It's basically the same story. From the new maximum aperture of f4, the image quality is brilliant in the middle and also very good in the corners, again with minimal chromatic aberration. It stays this sharp down to about f11, and beyond that, diffraction will again start to kick in. So, on the older 20 megapixel Canon 6D, we see a remarkably even performance from the lens as it yields fantastic image quality across the aperture and zoom range. The corners could have just a tiny bit more bite though, perhaps just a little more contrast, if I were being picky about it. Alright, let's test the lens on a far more challenging 42 megapixel full frame camera as I adapt it onto my Sony a7R II. Again, at 17mm, image quality is just about perfect in the middle, straight from f2.8. The corners, happily, are also very good. Stop down to f4 for even more sharpness there, and the image stays this sharp down to f11. Even on the 42 megapixel sensor, we're still seeing very little chromatic aberration. Let's zoom in to 35mm. At f4, image quality remains absolutely pin sharp in the middle. The corners, however, finally see a little drop in image quality, looking just averagely sharp. f5.6 and f8 are about the same, but again, at least we're not really seeing any chromatic aberration. Overall, I'm really quite impressed with the lens's performance on my high-resolution camera. Except for the slightly weaker corners at 35mm, this lens is bitingly sharp. I haven't tested it on APS-C this time, but if you were to fit it onto an APS-C camera, then the center image quality that we've seen so far indicates to me that it won't have any problems at all on a cropped sensor. Alright, let's see about distortion and vignetting on a full-frame camera. At 17mm, the lens has a barrel distortion problem. I actually focused slightly past my chart here to de-emphasize it, but it's still rather strong. At f2.8, vignetting is strong as well, but stop down to f4 and those corners brighten up quite nicely. Zoom in to 23mm and the distortion straightens out. Vignetting is still a little strong wide open though. Zoom all the way into 35mm and we see pincushion distortion, but it's not strong. Vignetting is noticeable at f4 and reduced at f5.6, and it stays at about this level if you stop down further. This lens can focus as closely as 28cm, nice and close really, although obviously it's hardly a macro lens. At f4, contrast levels are pretty low when shooting close-up, but stop down to f5.6 for clear image quality again. Let's see how this lens works against bright light, an important question for an ultra-wide-angle optic. Well, the great contrast we saw in the sharpness test continues even against harsh lighting, with only a scattering of tiny flecks of flaring here and there. That's a great performance, really. Now, the weather prevented me from doing any astrophotography, but still I completed a quick Coma test with this lens for you. In the image corners on a 42 megapixel camera, bright points of light show just a little Coma smearing at f2.8, about an average sort of level really. f4 sees an improvement, and f5.6 another tiny improvement. Finally, Bokeh. It's possible to get somewhat out of focus backgrounds with this lens if you move in close to your subject. The quality of this lens's bokeh is quite fine, especially for such a wide-angle lens. Blurry backgrounds look nice and soft. So, overall, the Tamron 17-35mm f2.8 to f4 DI OSD is really quite a simple lens with its fairly basic autofocus system and no image stabilization. But really, everything about it is done very well, from the nice build quality to the impressive image quality. It has neutral colours, plenty of contrast, and pretty striking resolution, particularly in the middle of your images, which are just spectacular. Its biggest weakness for me is that barrel distortion at 17mm, a bit of a pet peeve of mine. But apart from that, the Tamron 17-35mm f2.8 to f4 DI OSD is a super recommendable full-frame ultra-wide-angle lens, capable of really sharp results, and all for a pretty reasonable price, so it definitely comes recommended.